It had been 4 years since I last read Middle Game, and it's hard to believe I let so much time pass. It's one of my favorite books of all time, arguably like number like one or two. It's up there, the top two. This is also one of the few books that I've read or reread 3 times, 4 times total. That's just because how much I love it, and you can imagine in my disappointment when we finally got to Seasonal Fears. I mean, I say imagine, you can literally watch my review. I had so much rose-colored glasses for that review. Like, I wanted so much to love it, and I think, I mean, I did love it because it had that connection to Middle Game, that heart I had from Middle Game sort of carried over. After rereading Middle Game again and rereading Seasonal Fears for the first time, most of those rose-colored glasses have been removed, or at least mostly cleared off. There may be a slight tinge in how I see it, but I can see it for what it is, which is to say, a very mediocre book that has a lot of problems. But that's what makes me really excited, for the most part, to be talking about Tidal Creatures, Seanan McGuire's newest book in the Alchemical Journey series. I think it does a lot better. I think it makes a lot of noticeable improvements that are very easy to see when you read them all back to back. And I'm really excited to talk to you about why I think it works, for the most part, with some shortcomings. So let's start with understanding why Middle Game worked so much. I think it was 2 fundamental traits. One, just an amazing world, this Alchemical Journeys, where you have alchemical arts almost as a science, or magic as a science, mixed with 2 just really great characters. Not just these 2, but really Roger and Dodger are the core of Middle Game. For me, it's what I think gave it the heart. It's what helped me get emotionally attached to it, beyond just that rich world, because there have been plenty of amazing worlds created. Rarely do they hook me in as much as this one. When we get to book 2, Seanan McGuire, I think, sort of pushes characters to the side and is much more interested in just going balls deep into the world building. And at the time, like, I appreciated it for what it was. It's just a different way of telling a story, and I wanted to say it was perfectly fine for doing that. But really, it's not, because I think it fails for 2 fundamental reasons. One, the characters aren't compelling, which I've always sort of hinted at. I mean, our 2 main characters are like a boyfriend and girlfriend in high school, and I don't feel it. I don't believe it. It's very heteronormative, and there's nothing there that I could hook on to. The characters are compelling. The relationship isn't interesting. But also, there's a fundamental story of this ascension of these 2 seasons. Well, different than Roger and Dodgers, is still really fundamentally the same. And it's just, it becomes way more predictable. It's like almost like a foregone conclusion from the start that they're going to get what they want. And it's just something about it that just did not work. But even on the world building, we had to expand the world of the Alchemical Journeys. There's a problem in how Seanan McGuire communicates that, because it's just a lot of talking, a lot of exposition dumping in a way that feels a bit lazy. Tidal Creatures, I think, starts from the get-go doing a bit better in that it does an entirely new setup. Sure, we have this world where we're focusing on a new set of sort of alchemical creatures. Not alchemical creatures, yes, they're in here, alchemical creations. But that's really on the tangent. There's a difference between the alchemical arts and these creatures that embody the forces of nature, the seasons, the language and math or time. And in this case, we're talking about the embodiments, the incarnations of the moon itself. Instead of seeing the ascension of a new moon, we are seeing ourselves immersed in a story where the moons are already doing what they need to do. But something's happening. Someone is targeting the moon incarnations and taking them out. I say them because there's more than one. This story, I guess to go on a tangent, I didn't get into my written review, it really delves into the nature of these creations, and it's really fascinating as that. Because one, it's like I think it pulls on some really interesting ideas that have sort of been done before, but sort of just inspired by them. There's a hint of Piers Anthony's incarnations of mortality, where you have the Greek gods, the Greek figures, whether it be time, the fates, whatever, are being embodied by human beings who take on that position for some period of time before they pass it on. That's basically what this whole world is about, this whole universe is about. Don't read Incarnations of Mortality. There's so much wrong with Piers Anthony in that series, but like that idea is intriguing. And then there's also a bit of Neil Gaiman. Here we have American God-esque creation of these figures as sort of a byproduct of a human imagination, not quite the right word, but more like human ideas, the way we think about something, we embody it, whether we create it by thinking about it, the same way that American Gods kind of works. So it's this sort of mashup of American Gods, Incarnation of Mortality, where you have these incarnations of gods, kind of like it again in American Gods, where you have multiple gods depending on the region, depending on that particular incarnation, and it's a really fascinating introduction to the world, and I think it makes for a new dynamic. One, because we have more than one incarnation of this one entity, or slight variations on it, but also because we're not interested in the way in which they take on that mantle. We're going to be understanding what's happening while they're on that mantle, simultaneously understanding why they're being targeted and how do we fix this, how do we address this. So it's basically a murder mystery of sorts. Going back to Seasonal Fears and how I think it makes them, again, it doesn't do as well because it's doing sort of the same setup of this ascending figures of these incarnations. I don't think that's a fundamental problem, honestly. Like I think the story works better for not doing that. But the real problem with Seasonal Fears is the exposition dumping into world building, which is how that world building fails, as well as the just the bad characters. Tidal Creatures fixes this in two major ways. One, I mean, its characters are just fundamentally better. I think Seanan McGuire does a lot better job here at making these characters, one, feel real, but also interesting, much more compelling. Even those who are alchemical creations, which I feel like can at times feel a bit caricature. This is probably where the story fails the most, is how it characterizes alchemical creations. Roger and Dodger are alchemical creations, but they work as real entities. But then you have these other sort of failed experiments who heighten certain characteristics to a degree where, like, how do you present that in a story, that a way that feels natural? How do you imagine, how would these creatures actually act that isn't a caricature, but is still an embodiment of this heightened characteristics that they were made for? And generally speaking, the story is a lot better than the last one, where you have like just caricature villains and a main character who, I don't know, just doesn't have much depth. It does better. But it still feels like it stretches credulity at times in how they think, how they talk. But really, I think the story is helped by the fact that the suite of characters feels larger. Like, we're not just interested in those our creations, we're interested in others who are not byproducts like chemical creations. I don't want to say the real people, because that's part of the conversation here. So, like, what is a person? What does it mean to be a person? And really, once you're created and you have your own independent idea of self and thought, you are your own person. And that's the conversation here, which I do enjoy. I think it's part of what makes this world work. But that's one area of characterization where I think it does better, but could still stand to improve. Granted, it's easier said than done, because again, how do you walk that line of characterizing something that's supposed to be somewhat heightened in some ways while still making it feel real? Roger and Dodger work so perfectly for that. I think that's what I want it to be more like. I want something that I can see these tiny hints and the eccentricities, while also identifying them as just real people with their own core self. I think that's what it is. That's what I'm trying to get at, is beyond the eccentricities of these creations, there needs to be something deeper that feels like a core component of them beyond those eccentricities, something that, like, about their personality. And I think it's difficult to get to that point. That's what we need for these to work. Going back to just the main idea of the characters being done better, even when we get introduced to Roger and Dodger and Aaron again, which is inevitable, we get back to them like we do in Seasonal Fears, the story handles it so much better. Like, they feel more real, they feel more not just real, but they feel justified in the story, even to the extent where, like, we ask this question of, why is there a story at all? Why is there any conflict if these creatures are as powerful as Middle Game set them up to be? That's sort of addressed, and I think done fairly well, if not entirely satisfying, mostly good. But, like, the way in which they're handled feels more natural. It feels like they belong a bit better. But at the same time, this is where the story also tends to falter. But I will touch on why that is when I get to the second main point. To finish up the idea of characters, the last thing I want to talk about there, the characterization of villains. This is a thing that I've had mixed feelings about since the beginning of the entire series. I remember my first time reading Middle Game. I didn't love it because I felt like Reed was too caricaturish, and as was Lee. Upon reread, I appreciate it better because I didn't consider in the first read that these aren't necessarily people. They are creations, they're chemical creations. And upon reflection, I can see how they have perhaps more eccentricities than, say, Roger and Dodger, but there's still a level of depth there that I think feels justifiable. And that's what I meant by, going back to that other idea of the alchemical creations and the realness there. That extremeness isn't gone even as we get to books 2 and 3, as we look at villains, whether they be alchemical creations or just human beings from the start. There's a level of campy sociopathicness to them that walks the line of being a little too characterish, but I think generally works really well for me. Even in this book, I think it works really well. The problem I have here is that in this mystery, there's this big bad that, without giving anything away specifically, without giving any specific details away, I think the mystery is addressed just far too quickly, partly because the way it handles one of the major villains, I feel like is just not done well, in a sense that there's not enough focus on them to really, one, make the mystery compelling, but two, just to make them feel fully realized, help us understand their motivations. And that's a fundamental flaw of both the characterization of the villain, but also in the handling of the mystery, which again, I will touch on more when we get to the next part, which is the world building is generally much better. Even from the beginning, we get introduced to characters, we get some sort of exposition in their mind, or we get them to talk about themselves, but in a way that feels natural, like, well, you might be reflecting on, where you're at, why you're here. And how much it is, it's just, I think it's different when you approach it from that direction, whether it be internal dialogue or just some omniscient narrator versus them just narrating to the people that are around them, informing the characters of information you need them to know, but also informing the reader. It's just really clunky, doesn't work. And generally speaking, we avoid that, at least at the beginning of the book. By the time we meet Roger and Dodger, things get a bit more clunky. And generally, like I said before, I think they're handled much more effectively than in Seasonal Fears. Even that dialogue with them, that exchange, feels more natural, but there's still some exposition dumping. That is not just clunky, it's just fundamentally necessary. There's a level of, like, Seanan McGuire is talking to us as if we haven't read Middle Game. And even if we haven't read Middle Game, there are certain details about Roger and Dodger we just don't need to know. We don't need to know every detail. And what's worse is the way, it's not just that it's happening, or that there's exposition dumping. It's also just the way it's done. There is like this Whedon-esque banter going on, where there's this idea that Roger and Dodger, because they have this sort of quippy banter occasionally with each other, would be this way with everyone, including complete strangers. So they'll be this way and just give the full life story to everyone. And it stretches my credulity. It feels forced. It feels lazy, and it feels at worst unnecessary, like filler. There's a moment I just had to pause the book because I can't believe this is happening. This is not only really poorly done, it's just so fundamentally unnecessary. We don't need you to recap in the middle of the book stuff we already know or things that aren't necessary to the story. While I do think the book is better overall at not being fan servicey, I guess that's sort of what this must be. Again, it's not as bad as Seasonal Fears, but that is there, and I just don't understand why, because it is very distracting, and I think it makes the book much lesser for that. Even in the event where there needs to be some level of updating of the characters, like say there's information that's actually relevant to our characters that are new to the story, who need to know stuff that we as readers already know, there's a way of doing that. You just do a cutscene. There's a way of bringing it up to, okay, yeah, this is everything we just talked about, or something like that. And it's like we don't, as readers, don't need to know everything. And when you try to compress it, it's not only it feels like filler. It feels less natural because it's being so forced. Like there's some things we don't need to see as readers, especially when we already know the information. And I think part of it is holding our hands. And I get that this is a rich world and it's ambitious, but I also think that's why it's what increases the readability of the series, is that if it's compelling and interesting and a little confusing at times, it's confusing in the right ways. But then there's times where Seanan McGuire feels like she needs to hold our hands and tell us things over and over and over again for us to understand it or for it to make sense. And if you feel you need to do that, okay, but there are better ways of doing it. There are just better ways of doing it. And that's where the story falters in this aspect when it comes to explicit dubbing. Just, I think, not enough trust in your reader, which is what it is. Now, going back to the problem with the mystery, and that big bad, and the ending, because that's where it all kind of comes to a climax, where the ending ultimately feels rushed. And I'm beginning to think that maybe Seanan McGuire has an issue with endings sometimes, especially with this one in Seasonal Fears. Things just happen so quickly. I would like a middle game how like they there's this they reach this climax, and then there's like a big chunk of story after they've reached Ascension. There's a transition zone for them, and I get that. I like the idea of the story's over, but it's not really over. Not just like the epilogue type thing, but like actual conflict. And part of that is how we got to, revel in our evil, to allow them to be as ominous as they're supposed to be, I guess. And in this story, the ominous nature of our big bad is just not handled properly. And I can't really get at what a problem I have without, I think, spoiling it. But frankly, I think the way it's handled is kind of heavy-handed and probably going to be obvious. I just think it could have been a bigger mystery if the billing was handled differently, but also more effective. I think there was a lot more room if Seanan McGuire was just willing to be a bit more ambitious with how she was willing to integrate everything into the story. That's the most I can say without giving away, foundationally these discussions. I know technically I've given away details that are kind of already spoilery, but not really. I'm comfortable with the level of information I'm giving. It is what it is. We could talk all day about what constitutes a spoiler. How do you talk about a book without spoiling something? If you have an issue with it, you can let me know in the comments, because those are my general thoughts. Overall, the book, I really liked it. I feel like I'm shitting on it more than I did Seasonal Fears, but that's just because I finally managed to lower the tint on those rose-colored glasses, like I said at the start, where I know I had a bias going. I wanted to love it, even though I knew it was not that lovable. Still, this book, I enjoyed it. And I honestly want to reread it, partly because the parts where the storytelling and the world building is done effectively is done really effectively. It's really intriguing. It's really compelling. And most of the time, the characters are really interesting. Even when we get to see Roger and Dodger, I loved it not just because I got to see more of them, because it felt like they were integrated in the story in a way that worked. Yes, there were fundamental problems that I think just the story needs to address. And honestly, there's some irony here. And we think about Seanan McGuire trying to make this alchemical creation, just like her character is trying to create these alchemical creations to reach the impossible city. We're trying to reach the impossible book through this impossible story that Seanan McGuire is trying to perfect. And I commend her for that. I love that we have more of this. I'm glad she didn't give up, because I think it shows that there's a direction we can take the story that is worthy of telling. I wonder how far it's going to go, because right now, each book is integrating the Up and Under series with Zib and whatever his name is. And it's only 4 of those. Although rereading Middle Game, there were 14 of those. And we only got 4. So I'm curious how the story's going to handle that. That's definitely an incongruity. So to conclude, should you read the book? If you're a fan of Middle Game, I genuinely think you'll enjoy this. I won't say it's as good as Middle Game, but then again, Middle Game is an impossible standard to meet. I think it works overall. You might have some frustrations. I don't think it'll be a perfect book. If you're looking for perfection, it probably isn't for you. But if you like Middle Game, I think this does enough to recreate what we loved about Middle Game, if not quite as effectively. I still can't figure out what is going on with some of the ways in which Seanan McGuire is approaching this, whether it be deadlines or, just priorities. I don't know. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. And it honestly feels sacrilegious to critique her writing. But I think she could do better. And I think she has done better. And I love it overall. I really like it. I want to say I love it. It's not a yearly favorite, probably. But now I'm just rambling. If you stuck to the end, thank you so much. Let me know whether or not you think you might read this book. And if you have any questions, if you want spoiler thoughts, I'm happy to go deeper in the comments if you have any questions. I don't mind spoiling the book to anyone who wants to be spoiled. But hopefully this will be up today on publishing day. I should mention that June 4th, publishing should be coming out. For the first time, let me say thanks to Macmillan Audio for granting me an audio art. Amber Benson, I will say, is phenomenal. She embodies the alchemical creations and the alchemist to such a beautiful degree. It's so well brought to life. And I just absolutely adore her in this series. She is phenomenal. But with that said, I'm done. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Stay safe.